Hello, it's wonderful to see you, and it's wonderful to introduce to you Natasha Lester, author of the beloved historical novel, The Paris Secret, for a discussion about her latest novel translated into Romania, The French Photographer. Hello, Natasha.
Hello, how are you? And hi to everybody in Romania who's been reading my books. Thank you.
The Paris Secret has been a huge success, and we're very happy to translate another book. And I'm happy to tell all the readers that this book echoes the previous one in the fact that it has at the core, again, a very strong female character facing the war, but also because it's again written in that beautiful dual style of having the historical nuance, but then again, the contemporary nowadays glance by a contemporary woman, almost contemporary in the I think 2004, is it? Something like that, maybe?
I can't even remember. It's no, 2005, I think.
Yeah, that has to unveil with us step by step the mystery of a collection of photographs. So I wanted to start by you telling the listeners in a nutshell the story of this second book translated.
Of course. So The French Photographer is about a female photojournalist named Jess who works for Vogue during the Second World War, and she becomes an accredited photojournalist in Europe during the Second World War, and her role is to take photographs and write stories and send those back to Vogue in America. And when Jess arrives in Europe, she assumes her job will be relatively easy given that it's taking place in a war zone, but she doesn't realize how much prejudice there is against females being anywhere near the front lines of a war. So she basically has to fight to be able to do her job every single day. And you're right, there's also a contemporary storyline woven in there, which is set in a beautiful chateau in the Champagne region of France. So that was lots of fun to have to go and research.
Oh, I'm sure. So you've mentioned research, and I have to tell the audience that the inspiration for your protagonist is the legendary photographer Lee Miller. So I was wondering how you came upon her story, and especially how you managed to, put her real story into fiction in some of the traits of your character.
Yes, Lee Miller was an absolutely remarkable woman, and like the main character in my book, she did work as a photojournalist for Vogue during the Second World War. So I've basically used Lee's career trajectory during the war as the inspiration for Jess, the main character in my book. And the reason I did that was because Lee's life was incredible. She went to Europe. She fought against all the discrimination. She was one of the first people to take photographs of the US's use of napalm in Saint-Malo. She had set up this very famous photograph of her sitting in Hitler's bathtub in his apartment in Munich. So readers should definitely go online and take a look at her body of work because it's quite extraordinary. And she was the first person to look at the war and say, actually, there are a lot of women involved in the war. It's not just men's business, and nobody has told these women's stories. And she decided to tell their stories through photographs of the nurses, photographs of the civilian women left behind in the bombed out cities. There's another very famous photograph she's taken of a woman opera singing in Germany, the background behind her is just of ruined, crumbling buildings. So I loved that she looked at the war from a very different perspective. But I was also really shocked to find out that after the war, Lee didn't speak about her wartime work to anybody. In fact, it wasn't until after she died that her son discovered in the attic of Lee's home all of Lee's negatives and drafts of her stories that she sent to her Vogue editor. And he suddenly realized that his mother had done this amazing job during the war and nobody knew about her. She'd been forgotten because after the war, because all the men returned and took all of the jobs. So Lee was asked to go and photograph socialites in St. Moritz in the ski season and to write cooking reports for Vogue and things like that. So he was really responsible for bringing her back to people's notice and resurrecting her body of work. So I was fascinated by the idea of the work that she did in the war, the way she highlighted women during the war, and also the way in which history, as it does so often, forgot the story of this incredible woman. So I wanted to bring all of those different things to life in The French Photographer.
So how did you shape the main character? Because they are and they are not the same person.
Yeah, that's right. So I used a lot of, there are quite a few biographies written about Lee Miller, which I read all of those. There's also an extensive archival collection of Lee's photographs online. Barley Farm, her ex-home, is a museum that's open to the public and is able to be visited. So I went and visited that. And I also read through all of her reports that she wrote for Vogue during the war. So I was able to read what she wrote about the photograph of her in Hitler's bathtub, what she wrote when she first came upon the concentration camps, because she was one of the first women reporters to report on those. And so there were just small details. For example, when she first came upon the concentration camps, she took a series of photographs, and when she sent them to her editor, she wrote a note saying, "I implore you to believe this is true," because she was worried that her editor would think that she'd framed the photograph in such a way that it looked more horrific than it actually was, whereas Lee was trying to say, no, it is as horrible, in fact, more so than it looks in this photograph. So from reading all those primary documents, her reports, her letters, I was able to shape Jess around Lee. The reason I decided to not call my main character Lee and to give her a different name, but to use Jess's story, was because I wanted to have a dual narrative in there, and that depended on me being able to do some things in contemporary times that didn't happen to Lee. So I didn't feel like I could call her Lee and make so much up about her life. But yes, there are so many things that readers will find Jess sitting in Hitler's bathtub and having a photograph taken in the same way that Lee did. So they'll find a lot of similarities and resonances between my main character and Lee's life.
I really, I cannot shy away from saying that I've been reading your book in March 2022, and I never in my life expected that I would be reading a historical fiction set in the Second World War with an invasion at my country's borders. So it felt really timely, which I didn't expect, because especially today we get to see in real time on social media what's happening out there, especially because of the bravery of people, journalists and photographers reporting from that place. And you have that at the core of your story, someone who goes there and who sees what's happening on the front lines. So that's why I feel it's really timely right now, unfortunately, of course, but that just suggests that it's evergreen, and that at its core is the fact that we have to know history in order to not repeat the same mistakes, the famous saying. And I wanted to get to the fact that you're obviously a very talented writer, and I'm sure that if you wanted, you could write pinkish romantic story of a couple meeting in Le Marais in Paris, and it would be brilliant. But no, you don't shy away from handling very tragic and dramatic backgrounds and very real and important stories. So I wanted you to elaborate a bit on that very obvious choice and very, aware choice.
Yes, and I think you're right. I mean, it's horrific. As someone who has done so much research into the Second World War and has always thought, surely people can look back on what happened then and do everything they possibly can to make sure this never happens again. And then to see it's basically history repeating itself, and especially for all of you who are so close to what's happening there, it's absolutely terrifying. And one of the things I've always wanted to do in my books is to make sure that I bring to life war as it actually was, balanced with other elements, perhaps like fashion or the chateau in the Champagne region, that enable the reader to have both the darkness and the light. Because from everything I've read of firsthand accounts that people wrote who lived through the war and experienced the war, there were terrible, dark, bleak moments, but there were also hopeful, happy, joyful moments. So I want to make sure that my books capture all of those things, because particularly I think for, you know, we read a lot of stories about the horrific things that the men experienced, obviously, as they would right on the front line in the thick of battle, but we don't read so much about the terrible, awful things that the women in particular experienced staying back at home. They might not have been on the front line, but they suffered through rationing and deprivation and fleeing their homeland, as people are doing right now in Ukraine. And I've really, like you, have been watching social media and seeing that nowadays people are photographing and talking about all of those things and all of those different elements. It's not just a focus on the battle, so that we can see how it feels for a mother and child to be leaving their homeland and not knowing when they'll be able to return. So yeah, it's always been part of my strategy to show war in all of its facets, and not shy away from things like the concentration camps and discrimination and all the other things that happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to point out, that beyond the fact that it's a very inspirational story and it's well written and you have characters very humane and very nuanced, I just wanted to commend you on having, the courage to research such things and to put them into a veridic story, because it's very important for us to also read historical fiction, not only, romantic and contemporary fiction, in order to understand via fiction and via people's stories the world and, unfortunately, current events. Are there any other characters in your book that were maybe partially based on real life people? Because as in the previous novel, you have an array of maybe, let's say, secondary or other characters that are really convincing.
Yes, so Martha Gellhorn is one of the other characters who is obviously was a real person. Martha, I mean, a lot of people know her only as one of Ernest Hemingway's wives, but Martha did so much more than that. And I still can't believe she married Ernest Hemingway. He's not one of my favorite men.
I know.
Oh no.
True.
Momentary lapse of judgment, we'll put that down too. But Martha was also extraordinary. I mean, she reported on war for the whole of her life, right up until she died. And she basically dedicated her life to traveling to war zones and reporting on the realities and what was happening, because she wanted to make sure that these things never happened again. But of course, every time she went to a new war front, she'd be thinking, oh, here it is all over again. So she started in the Spanish Civil War in 1937 and continued to report after that. And I wanted to include other female reporters in my book to show that the experiences my main character goes through were common, and they were shared amongst all of the female correspondents. So rather than just having readers think, oh, maybe it was just this one woman this happened to, because Lee Miller happened to be a former model, so therefore she was, beautiful and renowned, so maybe she was treated differently. No, all the women were treated exactly the same way. And Martha's such an extraordinary woman. So Martha was the first woman to land on French soil post D-Day because she stowed away in the toilet of a hospital ship that was leaving England and going to France. And by that time, her relationship with Ernest Hemingway had soured and they were not getting along. And Martha, in fact, wanted a divorce, and he wouldn't come. He wasn't kind of committing to that. And so Ernest was desperate to get across to France and report on the D-Day invasion as well. And he didn't get to land on French soil, but Martha did. And I just loved that story of her, having to, because she was a woman, she wasn't allowed to go to France. So she had to hide in a toilet, but she managed to do it, and she managed to get onto French soil, and she managed to be the first woman to report, and she managed to beat Ernest to it. So that story is in the book, because I just thought that was an incredible example of Martha's bravery. And the worst part of that story is that as soon as she returned to England, she was basically jailed because she'd broken the terms of her accreditation by going to France, because the women were supposed to stay in London. But as they all said, how can we report on a war when we're in London and the war's in France? So she had her passport taken off her, her accreditation papers taken off her. She was locked up in a nurses' training camp and told she was never going to be allowed near the war again. But Martha, being Martha, she escaped from the training camp and she talked her way onto a troop ship going down to Italy because she thought that there'd be a lot less attention on the war in Italy now that the invasion had happened in France. And so she was right. She was able to report on Italy for a few months before everything settled down, and she returned to France to continue reporting from there. So she was remarkable, and I couldn't help but write about her and fall in love with her character as I did so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was aiming at precisely letting the readers know that life is actually more spectacular than fiction, and maybe, you know, they're reading this and they're thinking, wow, Natasha is really creative. Actually, you know, life was more creative, but it's again very important to have those stories put in this fictional frame where we can digest them you know, easier. I wanted to ask you about war photography, because in the previous book, we certainly felt very strongly that you researched the history of fashion, and you had a very, you know, perfect sense of how to include that history in your story. And I was wondering what the research here was for war photography, which is, of course, a very special, let's say, kind of photography, because it can either be propaganda or it can be, you know, revealing and reporting in the real sense of the word.
Yeah, absolutely. So I made sure that I looked at photographs from both female photographers and male photographers at the time, so that I could see what the differences were and what things were being focused on. And of course, because the men were allowed to stay in press camps, which were at the front line, they were able to take photographs of different things to the women. And it was interesting. One of the books that I read was Margaret Bourke-White's memoir. So Margaret Bourke-White was one of only 2 credited female photojournalists during the Second World War. And she started off reporting out of Italy at the end of 1943, before most of the women had gone to Europe. So she was really one of the first. She was a trailblazer, in fact. And you know, Italy, the Allied landings in Italy took place in September 1943, and people back in America didn't understand what that actually meant until Margaret started taking photographs and writing about what was happening there. Her memoir's they called it Purple Heart Valley, because in Italy, it was the place where they gave out the most Purple Hearts in any war, because the fighting conditions were so treacherous. And she talks about, she was staying at a hospital camp in Italy near Monte Cassino, and the camp was bombed, and all the electric lights went out in the hospital. And so she was asked to help stand in an operating theatre holding a torch, a flashlight, so that the surgeons could see what was happening while they operated, because there were men arriving all night long with injuries, needing to have limbs amputated, and they needed everyone they could possibly get to help. So Margaret stood there holding a flashlight, helping the surgeons to operate, passing them scalpels and surgical material for the whole night. And the way she writes about that and the photographs that she takes of that night are quite extraordinary, in a way that you couldn't imagine what it was like unless you read her report and wrote and saw her photographs. And so you're right, you know, fact is much stranger than fiction. It would be very hard to make those stories up. You have to actually look at the source material to do that. So I really did make sure I combed through all of the different perspectives of war, from the photographs that, you know, Lee took of the hospital camps in France, to Margaret's photos, even to photos of civilian life in England during the war, and how, you know, how there are so many photographs of women, particularly drinking cups of coffee, sitting on a mound of rubble that was their home the night before, but then was suddenly bombed. And you got that sense of people's strength and the way they made themselves go on, even in the face of things that now, in our very luxurious, easy life, we would think would be impossible to survive.
So where there's darkness, there's always light, and your novel definitely, although it has this, dramatic background, it has stories about strong friendships and people inspiring one another and pushing one another to be better. And you have at the center a very beautiful relationship between a man and a woman, a very mature one, because they don't fall in love at first sight. There's the very good nuance of friendship and camaraderie long before anything turns into something else. And I love that you have mature relationship throughout the whole book. And for our final seconds together, I wanted you to tell the future readers of the second book what you think its most powerful takeaway would be after reading it.
I think the thing I would like readers to take away from the book is the sense that we can find inner strength even in the most trying circumstances. There's one instance in the book where the main character Jess is trying desperately to be allowed to go to France to report on the war rather than be stuck in London, and she tries everything she possibly can, and the men are trying everything they possibly can to keep her in her place in London. And there are a couple of scenes in particular that I'm thinking of where she just says probably what she shouldn't say, regardless of the consequences, because she knows that even if she is forbidden and she isn't allowed to, every time she stands up, maybe it changes things for the people who come after. And so I guess that's part of what the book is about. It's always thinking about this is just one moment in history, but there are so many moments that will come after this moment, and we need to be the best people possible for our moment so that we can make all the moments for everyone else coming after into better moments. So yeah, that's probably the message that I hope people take away from the book.
Which again, unfortunately for us, but fortunately for the power of fiction, is very timely, and it's really a great takeaway at this point for Romanian readers. Natasha, Lester, thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, thank you so much for talking to me, and I hope that everybody enjoys the book.
Thank you.